What does a recession sound like? I spend most of my time working in audio, so I spend a lot of time thinking about what things sound like. But what does a recession sound like was a new one for me. This is a story that I reported from Marketplace, and it is about one of the most famous recession predictors out there. It is called the yield curve, and it's something economists watch a lot. It has been flashing red for 20 months. The yield curve is what they call a leading indicator, meaning it goes off before a recession, and it's got a long lead. Anywhere between 6 months and 2 years before a recession, the yield curve inverts. So what does that mean? To break down the yield curve, let's start out with the yield part. So the yield would be bond yield, and a bond is basically like a little loan you give the government. And these loans come in all kinds of durations. There are 4-week bonds and 3-month bonds and 1-year bonds and 5-year bonds. And the big one is the 10-year T-note, a 10-year bond. And basically how this works is you lend the government your money, and at the end of that time, the government pays you back for that loan plus a little bit of interest. And that interest is called the yield. And as you can imagine, the longer the government's holding on to your money, the higher the yield should be, right? I mean, if I lend somebody $1,000 and they're gonna pay me back in 4 weeks, I might ask for, okay, well, when you pay me back, can I get $1,050 or something like that? Now, if I agree to lend this person $1,000 for 10 years, at the end of that 10 years, I'm gonna want something to show for it. I want $1,200 or $1,500 back. So here's where the curve part of the yield curve comes in. So if you were to lay out all of these different kinds of government bonds in order of duration, so you had like the 4-week bond and the 3-month bond and the 1-year bond and the 5-year bond and the 10-year bond and the 30-year bond, and you laid them out, that should make a curve. The shorter term bonds where you're lending your money to the government for 4 weeks, that should have, a little bit of interest rate, a little yield. Now, when you're lending your money to the government for 10 years, that yield should be higher. You should be getting a little bit extra money for the government holding on to your money. So the yield curve should look like this. Now, if you were to play the yield curve on like a cello, like I got my wonderful editor Amanda Peacher to do, the yield curve would sound like this. That is a healthy yield curve. Now, what's happened in the last 20 months is that something has happened to the yield curve. It has inverted. And what that means is that the government is now paying people more to borrow their money for 4 weeks than to borrow their money for 10 years. And this happens when people start to get really worried about safety. So the 10-year treasury note, the 10-year government bond, this is considered to be the safest investment in the world. Like, you put your money in the 10-year T-note, you are definitely gonna get your money back. So you have so many people wanting to lock their money away for a long time, someplace they don't have to worry about it, don't have to think about it, that it has increased demand for the US 10-year T-note, the 10-year treasury bond. And because of that, the government does not have to pay a lot of interest. So the yield on the 10-year T-note has dropped a lot. And when this happens, the yield curve inverts. And this is the sound of an inverted yield curve. This is the song of the inverted yield curve, and it is seen as a very bad omen in an economy. The yield curve has correctly predicted every single recession since the 60s. So I put this question to Campbell Harvey. He is the economist who identified the yield curve as a recession predictor back in the 80s. Do you think the yield curve is right? Do you think we're about to go into a recession? And he said he thinks we're on the edge of a slowdown that could possibly lead to a recession. However, he did say he thought it would be a soft landing recession, meaning a really mild recession. And he actually thinks the reason for this is the yield curve itself. Because the yield curve has been inverted for so long, you've seen companies slowing expansion, slowing growth. And what Campbell Harvey says is, yes, this is really hard on an economy, but what it also does is prevent a shock from happening. In other words, if business leaders didn't feel like they had this warning flashing, they might continue to expand and hire and grow. And then all of a sudden, when the economy slowed down, there would be a crash. So it's really interesting to me because the song of the inverted yield curve has slowed our economy down. but it may have prevented us from entering a much deeper, more severe recession. Now, in recent days, a big part of the yield curve has uninverted. It's singing its normal song again. I did ask Campbell Harvey about this, and he pointed out that typically right before the recession, that is when the yield curve uninverts. So he predicts whatever is going to happen is probably going to happen pretty soon.